From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We're joined as always with our super producer, Paul Mission Control Decant. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. Heads up, fellow conspiracy realists, in the course of this episode, you may hear what sounds like a few muffled explosions. They are not the brilliant design of our super producer. They are the nefarious design of some guys who decided to build a staircase today behind my house. So just if you know, yeah. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Trying to improve the area.
It's strange. It's strange, but wishing them the best. They're better than the leaf blower guy, who I think is a nemesis for a lot of us nowadays.
What kind of staircase are we talking, Ben? Is it a nice spiral staircase? Is it some like brutalist architecture, or is it just a run-of-the-mill, set of stairs?
It is in the running, Noel, for the noisiest set of stairs I have ever encountered. I don't know if it's PR stunt, promotion for the advantages of elevators. Unclear.
Hey, did we ever find out if we're going to get sued for was it Dr. Dre? Who was it? Notorious B.I.G. in the background? We're not, right?
I don't think so. I hope not. And please, any legal departments listening, treat that as the tribute it is. Treat that as the tribute it is. Today's episode comes to us courtesy of our fellow conspiracy realist, Tom, over in Europe. And Tom, you wrote to ask us about a proven conspiracy that took place not too long ago. It's a conspiracy that many people have never heard of, which is going to be odd when we get further into the story. And our story really begins with NGOs. One in particular, Greenpeace. We were talking about this a little bit off air. Have you guys ever met anybody who volunteered for Greenpeace?
No, I knew somebody who was in the Peace Corps. That's not the same thing, though, I don't think.
No, honestly, I've not met any individual who's worked for them.
Yeah, what does that mean, guys? The same on my end. Are we just like terrible people? We don't move in do-gooder circles?
I think you're right.
or hot take, it's not real. There is no Greenpeace.
I like both of these. It's true. There are going to be some people in the audience today who are thinking, oh, hold on, guys, hold your badgers. Greenpeace isn't all that great. And it's true that Greenpeace has a lot of critics. So maybe we start with the origins of Greenpeace to really get into the conspiracy today. Here are the facts. What is it? Sounds cool.
Well, it describes itself as a, quote, global independent campaigning organization that uses peaceful protest and creative communication to expose global environmental problems and promote solutions that are essential to a green and peaceful future. Oh, I had to take a breath there in the middle. That's a lot of stuff. A lot to unpack. Sounds good on the surface, though, doesn't it?
It really does. And its origins go back to a time when that kind of thing, that kind of effort was very popular. Back to the 1960s, officially founded in 1971. So there's activism occurring in the 1960s, and it kind of turns into this organization called Greenpeace.
Yeah, so the origins of what we know as Greenpeace today come from anti-nuclear testing activism. Mm-hmm. Specifically, the protests leading to Greenpeace really kicked off in the 60s, but the organization was officially founded in 1971 explicitly to stop nuclear testing at Amchitka Island in Alaska.
That's right. And they really did focus on nuclear testing and preventing that from occurring in the future for a little while there, so at least several years. In 1972, there's a gentleman named David McTaggart. He took a small sailing vessel along with two other Greenpeace, members, and they sailed out to this place called the French Exclusion Zone in the Pacific. And the whole point there was to stop the French government from exploding another nuclear weapon in a test out there in a specific atoll that they had control over, because France has some land, essentially, or some land and ocean area that they own out there in the Pacific Islands. And they sailed this ship out, this, small little vessel, in essentially just defiance of the French government and saying, well, we're here. You can't really test a nuke because we're here. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. And they went back and forth. This is a pattern for Greenpeace. They go back and forth opposing various institutions. They're doing things that they find objectionable. And it expands beyond worries about nuclear weaponry. The organization has always been relatively loose-knit, and it started tackling these other global issues. So I don't know about you guys, but when I think of Greenpeace, before we dove into this, I would immediately think of someone on a boat trying to stop whalers. That's what I associate them with.
Yeah, almost more like a PETA situation or something that's more humanitarian towards wildlife and like the environment in particular.
Well, yeah, and that they are known for that because that is what Greenpeace did for a long time, especially, from the mid 1970s to around actually until the early 1980s when they picked nuclear testing back up. But I just want to jump back to France really quickly, guys. I'm sorry I didn't completely finish what I was going to talk about there. Just because this episode is dealing with France, and it's kind of, I don't want to spoil too much right now, but it's dealing with Greenpeace versus the French military, basically, and the French government. So that time in 1972, when they took that small vessel out there, they ended up, their boat ended up getting rammed, and they got arrested. But it didn't deter them from going back, because the next year in 1973, McTaggart and the crew returned for a second demonstration. This time, the French authorities tried to bribe them. They were like, okay, just get out of here, please. We want to test nuclear weapons, guys. And they tried to give them $5,000, or at least it was $5,000 US at the time in 1973. Didn't work. Then they sent a small, I don't know, it's not a dinghy, I don't think, but it's like an inflatable craft, essentially, or a tiny little boat out.
Can we just call it a dinghy?
Military.
Let's just call it, I love a dinghy. I'm sorry.
It's a dinghy. But they were some military operatives from probably the French government or someone on behalf of the French government. I'm not exactly sure who it was, but there is photographic evidence of it. They came out to the ship, boarded, and beat the living crap out of the Greenpeace members. The only reason why we know about it is because one of the crew members had a still camera, was able to snap a couple shots while it's happening, then jumped down inside the sailing ship and hid the camera. And the authorities found a second camera that they thought was the one she was taking pictures with, and destroyed the film and threw it in the ocean. But she had hidden the other camera, and that film survived. So it was just proof that it had occurred. All that's to say, Greenpeace and the French government / military are at odds already in the early 70s.
Greenpeace in multiple countries, I would say, especially France, that seems like a low price for a bribe. And sending French commandos on a scene like that is no laughing matter. Those guys don't mess around. So you have to at least, whether or not you agree with Greenpeace's tactics, you do have to commend their courage in pursuing, these ideals. When we say that they use creative communication, that little bit of PR speak from their official site, it's helpful to have examples of what we mean, because it verges into performance art. There was a time when 10 Greenpeace activists dressed as polar bears to protest against Arctic drilling by Gazprom, the Russian energy giant. And then they also dressed as zombies and took over Quezon City in the Philippines in 2012. So this is like theater as protest as well. They, in addition to attempting to prevent people from hunting seals and cetaceans, they also work actively to prevent the dumping of toxic radioactive waste at sea. Historically speaking, they tend to use what they call direct but nonviolent actions. So just like you were describing, Matt, they'll They'll steer a small dinghy between a whaler's harpoon and the target, or they'll go over to an industrial pipe that's discharging waste, and they'll physically plug it up. These things can be expensive for those institutions, but they themselves endeavor not to harm other people. So you might hear NGO like this described with the phrase eco-terrorist, right? Or they're committing acts of eco-terrorism by damaging property. But to be very clear, they are not actively out there, kidnapping people or bombing them and stuff like that. But all these actions, whether they're to bring awareness to something or whether they're to prevent what is seen as an environmental crime, have brought Greenpeace a lot of attention over the years, a ton of attention. But make no mistake, folks, not all of this attention is positive.
This is true. But let's just not forget that Greenpeace is also active in the legal and regulatory spheres and have been a huge voice in pushing for tighter environmental regulation and oversight. And like we said earlier, just the kinds of things that you would associate probably automatically with when you think of Greenpeace. And sometimes these efforts have been very successful. And today the organization has a pretty small staff, most of whom are volunteers. And a lot of their funding comes from donations from individuals. So how do we separate kind of the fact and the fiction and the controversy? These are three kind of tiers of today's episode in Greenpeace.
Yeah, it's a good question, Noel. So as you can imagine, Greenpeace sees itself speaking truth to power, right? These are folks who are, nobody is involved in Greenpeace to get rich. They are, as you said, volunteers, and they get into direct conflict with some of the world's most powerful institutions, some of the biggest corporations that you may or may not have heard of, as well as, as you pointed out, Matt, state-level actors. And so, of course, this creates a lot of criticism, but it's not just from these institutions. You know what I mean? It's not just like Captain Planet villains having a problem with Captain Planet and the, the Planeteers. Shout out to Hart, man. I always thought he got the short end of the stick, but he did get a monkey.
He did have a monkey. What was his monkey's name? Well, the guy's name was, there was Kwame. He was Water, maybe? Oh gosh, I'm really doing bad with my Captain Planet trivia, but the monkey was adorable. You're right though. Hart, I didn't really get a sense that what it was, his power to make people feel emotional.
I guess so.
Dude, if you can change hearts and minds, the heart is connected to the mind. And if you can change hearts, guys, you can do anything.
So secretly, it was a mind control power all along.
Yeah, they just didn't want to spook everyone. But the reason we're bringing up this Captain Planet comparison is because it's important to know that not all the people who criticize Greenpeace over the years are like Gazprom or something, or the French military or something. There are people who have worked for Greenpeace in the past that are no longer with the organization and have some pretty bluntly critical things to say about it. But because this is a loose-knit organization with several different types of causes, a lot of the criticism tends to be issue-specific. So somebody might say, for instance, and just a made-up example, someone might say, look, I am totally with Greenpeace. We need to end whaling now, but they're acting crazy when they're against nuclear power. Clean energy is the way of the future. You know what I mean? So they might not throw the entire organizational baby out with the bathwater, but again, their critics are not all evil. In 2016, 107 Nobel Prize laureates signed a letter begging Greenpeace to stop its opposition to GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And you can read about these incidents. They're pretty well documented. But they've also been accused of either unintentionally or maybe intentionally exaggerating the severity of certain issues. Like it turned out they were inaccurate when they were reporting the amount of toxic waste on something called the Brent Spar oil storage buoy in 1995. And they went back and corrected it, but sort of the damage was done, and then anybody who was opposed to their agenda would be able to say, these guys are making a mountain out of a molehill, they're enemies of progress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And really just this anti-nuclear weaponry, deterrence, proliferation, all that stuff, being anti-biotech, anti-innovation. Yeah, some would argue that. Some have argued that it's really just an anti-technology group. Like it's an anti-progress group. But I don't know about that. That's certainly they've been accused of that, right? And I wanted to talk to you guys really quickly before we jump into the next section here. This concept of being anti-nuclear weapon, especially weapon testing, it's such a gray area for me because yes, and it weirdly, and I haven't always felt this way, but simply because we've talked about on this show so many times the reasons that a country would have nuclear weapons, have that capability, and also show it off to an extent and learn as much as they can about it as a way of preventing themselves from being at risk from other world superpowers with nukes. I can see why a government or a country like France would be very much interested in testing nuclear weapons in the 1960s and 70s as the Cold War is escalating between the other superpowers. I can see why they would want to establish their position as a powerful nation that can't be messed with, essentially. There could be machinations in South America and some of these other places where, the Soviet Union and the United States are playing their little war games and or, terrorizing humans and nations. Like they would want that really badly. And it could be very beneficial for all of the citizens of France. So the greater good argument, I think I can see for France, for people in charge there.
It's tough to say that to the people at the testing sites, though, right?
Exactly. On the other side, like you're wreaking absolute havoc on people in the environment which they lived for, however many generations. I'm not saying the nuclear testing is a good thing. I'm saying that I can see it more clearly now why it was viewed as so important to the French government.
Yeah. And we've talked about similar, highly unethical problems in the past. Imagine being one of those U.S. scientists who says, okay, our best plan is to steal the bodies of children. And everybody signed off on it because they thought it was a dirty job, but it was for an ultimately better world. And that's up to future historians to debate the accuracy of that or the sincerity, I would argue. But
I guess what I'm at the end of that, I agree with you. I think it's not hard for any of us to see why Greenpeace's stance in the 1970s and then later, what we're about to enter into, of being against nuclear testing was kind of a no-brainer. Yes, well, yeah, a lot of people can get behind that notion.
But what's the alternative? By being against nuclear testing, are you also just purely against nuclear weapons?
Yeah, that's the thing. Because it's a dual-use technology, there's not really – it's really tough. It's a tall milkshake to continually monitor a country with nuclear capabilities and somehow ensure that they never just keep the centrifuges spinning to the point that they create nuclear weapons. It's tough. It's a dilemma. But the big takeaway here is this. Greenpeace started because they wanted global disarmament as an ultimate end goal. And today, opponents of Greenpeace will argue that it might create more problems than it attempts to solve. And supporters of Greenpeace may argue that, look, hey, this organization is imperfect, but cut them some slack. Their overall aim is some real Captain Planet stuff. They're well-intentioned. If their stuff works, then it's vital to the long-term sustainability of life on Earth, human life as well as wildlife. And, usually these disagreements and these tensions result in heated legal battles, sometimes public protest and confrontations, and then arguments and debate. Until one day, France blew their ship out of the water. We're going to pause for a moment for a word from our sponsors, and then we'll introduce you to Operation Satanic.
What did you say?
Clearly involves puppies, right? I mean, it just has to.
Yeah. Yes. Here's where it gets crazy.
All right, now let's introduce you to the Rainbow Warrior. You saw the title of this episode. That's what this whole thing's about. The Rainbow Warrior was a trawler-class vessel, a ship, not just a boat. This is a ship, guys. And it was built in the United Kingdom in 1955.
And it was called the Sir William Hardy. It is up to you whether you prefer the name Rainbow Warrior or Sir William Hardy. A trawler is essentially a motorboat that is seaworthy. So they wanted this because it can make long ocean voyages. It's not super impressive, as it's not on the level of a billionaire's yacht or something. No one's living the high life on this. It's a workboat for a mission. And when Greenpeace UK got a hold of the vessel back in 1977, that's when they renamed it. They spent about 4 months retrofitting it. And on May 2nd, 1978, they launched it. And they decided to call it the Rainbow Warrior. It's named after a book written by one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, a guy named Robert Hunter, wrote a book called Warriors of the Rainbow. The titular line of the book, if you're interested, is, "The world is sick and dying. The people will rise up like warriors of the rainbow." I'm not 100% sure what that means, but it's inspirational.
Well, it's like, warriors from all over the place who look like everyone possibly could look on Earth, and we're all going to fight for it.
Okay. Yeah,
it's cool, man.
That's something you could get behind,
Super chill. In a revolutionary kind of way. But it should be noted that this ship was just rusted out, looked nasty. You can see footage of it in, there's a documentary that Greenpeace put out that's called The Boat and the Bomb. So you can really check out some retro footage of this ship as it was being changed over into the Rainbow Warrior.
It definitely needed that 4-month glow up.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. But let's just jump from there. 1978, I think, is when it was fully retrofitted. But then 1981, after it had been out on a couple of different missions, they reignite this campaign that had kind of gone away since the early 70s, this anti-nuclear weapons testing campaign. And when they did that, they wanted the Rainbow Warrior not just to be a fossil fuel powered vehicle. They wanted to be a little greener. Hey, come on, the name's Greenpeace, right? So they further retrofitted the thing. They put sails on it, massive sails. So now it's both a motorboat and a sailing vessel.
And that's form and function there. And if you think about it, that move makes sense because the most immediate criticism for an organization like Greenpeace using a boat like this would be, hey, you guys know what those run on, right? So it's a valid criticism. And our story really kicks off here in 1985. The Rainbow Warrior set sail for Auckland, New Zealand, and they are on the way to a very specific, infamous atoll in the world of environmentalism.
That's right, the Moruroa Atoll. The idea was to connect with this assembly of 8 other vessels, this flotilla, and prevent the next firing of a nuclear weapon. And this area had long been a popular destination for testing. Atolls and remote islands often are, like the Marshall Islands episode we just talked about, where the risk of collateral damage is seen on paper as being, low, but we know what happened with that story. It has long-term consequences that are not often thought of up front, but as long as the math adds up, then it'll all be okay. But it, often isn't. So in 1966, the French had begun testing nuclear weapons in this area, and they'd continue to do so till 1996, which is crazy to me, despite these very intense protests. And Greenpeace says and argues that the initial test alone, which was codenamed Aldebaran, I believe that's how you pronounce it, which happened on July 2nd in 1966, spread contamination as far as Peru and New Zealand. That's that collateral damage we're talking about. And it oftentimes, far exceeds initial expectations because, there's all kinds of other variables like the winds and currents and things like that. So it's an absolute understatement to say that tensions ran high. They ran absolutely nuclear, pun completely intended. That wasn't really a pun. Whatever. It was very tense.
It was wordplay. It was wordplay.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate you having my back. But these French commandos, you see, had boarded a previous protest boat that trespassed into this exclusionary shipping zone that was bordering the atoll. And Greenpeace knew full well, or at least, to some degree, that the risks were there. And they planned to monitor the impact of these tests and place protesters on the ground to monitor the actual blast.
Yeah, like we can't stop you, but the world will witness your actions on this day. And these are very motivated people. They are, again, they're not working on a profit motive. They are working toward, in their ideology, a better world. And they're not there to attack these military officers or attack the scientists conducting these tests, but they want to do their best to make it really inconvenient to conduct these tests. And, I think in Greenpeace's favor, they were one of the organizations that was openly saying something that I think a lot of governments were privately saying, which is this: you all do not know the full extent of your actions. You do not know the consequences. You will probably mess something up, and maybe you'll get some valuable data, but that is not going to, improve the lives of the people who may suffer the consequences of these experiments. But Greenpeace, despite being very aware of the dangers of nuclear Armageddon, they were blissfully unaware of some things closer to home. You see, folks, Greenpeace did not know that before they went on this fateful trip to the atoll, they had already been compromised, and for quite a while.
Yeah, that's right. There was a person named Christine Carbone. She was not just your regular old person. She was an agent. Oh, yeah. A spy. She was working for France's Directorate General for External Security, or the DGSE. This is, again, in the same way the CIA operates outside of the U.S. or MI6 operates outside of the U.S. That's what this organization does. DGSE. Remember that name. So she had gone in and volunteered to join Greenpeace. And back in the day around that time, it was super easy to infiltrate Greenpeace. You just said, hey, I want to help. And they're like, come on in.
The story checks out. Hop on board.
Yeah. And she infiltrated through Auckland, New Zealand, which is, interestingly enough, where, remember, we already talked about this, where the Rainbow Warrior had set out to go before they went over to the atoll in the area where the testing is actually occurring, because it's not that far away. And she posed as someone else. She pretended to be someone named Frédérique Bonlieu. And she was and this character that she was portraying was an environmentalist. She was all about Greenpeace, all about anti-nuclear proliferation and stopping testing. But really what she was doing is just going, oh, what's that? And then making a phone call to somebody and taking notes and just monitoring all the communications, collecting maps where they're going to go. If there are any plans or information, intel on what's about to occur, she's doing this stuff. And she's also checking out the tech that's aboard the ship. What capabilities does this ship have, and how can we subvert them?
And let's get some specifics on the hull, says Frederick. I'm a just like you guys, I'm a utility player. I want to know everything. I want to get in where I can fit in. And the Rainbow Warrior, there was a lot of PR around it, because this makes for great headlines. So for a time, it was open for public viewing. And all sorts of tourists and honeymooners and supporters of Greenpeace and just curious onlookers toured the ship to learn more about what Greenpeace planned to do with this vessel. Thing is, some of those tourists were also DGSE. They were operatives. This part of spycraft always seems so, I know it's got to be a real nail biter on the anxiety scale, but I always wondered, do they take acting lessons? Like if you were posing as a couple on honeymoon who just happened to walk by a ship and wants to take a tour of it, do you have to like practice acting like a couple? You know, do you spend a week together just working on your bits? I don't know.
It's called improv for espionage.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
You know, I don't have personal experience, but I would say acting classes would probably help out.
Yeah. I think you're right to a degree. And they're really interesting stories about how people train spies to act undercover. There was a great interview with the lady who was in charge of CIA disguises for a number of years. And what's funny about that is that she is pretty casual with it. She's like, okay, we can teach people to walk differently. We can give them wigs. We can change different parts of their appearance. Here are the things I think work. Here are the things I think don't work. And when she was asked, like, what is the number one problem with, you know, having people move in these false personas or disguises, she said, ego. She was like, nobody wants to look bad. And, you know, if you think about it, looking a little bit homely would help you with your cover, right? Unless you're supposed to be a model or a movie star. But anyway, that aside.
I would say that's what always works out in those undercover TV shows with models and or superstars. The only way they get them to fit in is making them more homely.
Yeah. Let's give them a weird nose.
Look more like us.
No, we look okay. You know, I'm not going to rate us, but I think we look all right. Anyway,
solid eights, solid 7.5 eights.
Oh, you know, that's nice, man. It's good for. I'm not going to ask what the scale is there, but thank you.
Unclear.
Goes to 20. All right, continue.
All right, so here's what happens. Clearly, you know, Greenpeace is relying on transparency because they want the support of the public. They are not a military. They are not a government actor. So they depend on volunteers. They depend on people who agree with both their goals and the ways in which they pursue those goals. And this comes back to haunt them. I suggest we take a pause for a word from our sponsor and return to July 10th, 1985. We're back. Set the scene. The ship is docked. It is pretty late. There's been a birthday party on the vessel earlier that evening, and there are about 12 people on board. The ship is prepping to head out to confront the French authorities conducting this nuclear test. And right before the stroke of midnight, an explosion rocks the vessel. Boom. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, as you can imagine, chaos ensues. The crew scrambles to escape. It's not the time to go into the engine room and see what made that noise. They want to stay alive, right?
And that is where the first explosion originates, is in or near the engine room.
Right, exactly. And so everybody is getting off the vessel, and they wait for just a second. There's one guy, a Portuguese photographer named Fernando Pereira, and after this explosion, after he gets away, he looks around and he thinks, oh, snap, I need to get all of my stuff, my equipment. We're documenting this. I'm a photographer. I need my camera and my film. And so he returns to the ship to grab his gear right after that first explosion, and he's on board when the second explosion occurs.
Yeah, and he's killed by that second explosion, and his death was the impetus for the initial investigation into this whole situation. One of the largest in the history of New Zealand. A homicide investigation begins, and two French agents, Captain Dominique Prière and Commander Alain Maffar, are identified by a local neighborhood watch. Which is
right?
Interesting. Yeah, like what? There's like neighborhood watches at sea. I mean, that's very unusual.
Well, there's a lot of weirdness that's going on behind the scenes that we later find out. There were numerous French agents inside Auckland at the time, specifically focusing on this ship, this vessel, on the Rainbow Warrior and on Greenpeace's activities. And it's crazy. We can maybe talk about it a little more. Several of the either teams of agents and or just individual agents were not so good at being spies, I guess, at like covering their tracks and at being inconspicuous.
Yeah, and not to play backseat espionage, right?
Yeah, sorry. People. I mean, dude.
Yeah. Do you know?
It's just they were much more easily identified by groups like that Neighborhood Watch than you would expect.
How amazing it'd be the people at Neighborhood Watch, though. They must have been pretty impressed with themselves, right?
I think this guy might be a spy.
That is a big one. I mean, if I was on a Neighborhood Watch and I, landed this whale, I would feel pretty good about myself and feel like Neighborhood Watches far and wide should take note.
No, he's not a spy. Why would he be a spy in Auckland? No, he's not a spy. What accent is this?
I don't know. It's kind of Cockney. A little bit of Mary Poppins.
Yeah. It feels like a spy is trying out some accents. Watch out for bits. That's what I remember from Flight of the Conchords. But also, if you're that Neighborhood Watch person, and we don't have the specific name of the individual or individuals in the Neighborhood Watch who were instrumental in these arrests, but if I were that person, I'd make certain that comes up in some way in every neighborhood meeting, every HOA meeting. Hey, New Zealand Ben, you're not mowing your lawn on time. And I'm like, oh, sorry, I was busy saving the neighborhood. I don't know where your priorities are, Gladys, but if I'm catching spies, I can't do it while I'm mowing my lawn. I would be insufferable.
For me, it would be like, raise your hand. Hi, Matt Frederick, caught those spies that one time, Neighborhood Watch.
Yes, exactly. So, good on them, honestly. But this becomes very complicated very quickly because, as you said, Matt, there is a lot of stuff going on in the background. It's not just these two guys. And at this point, Carbon hasn't been made yet. She's still Frederic. And there's a problem because there's public outcry, right? New Zealand is saying this is a terrorist attack. France is an ally of New Zealand. And at first they're like, yeah, it's crazy. What happened? The world is a nutso place, you guys. And then they said, of course, we aren't involved. Like all these other nations, we condemn this terrorist act. The French embassy in Wellington stated explicitly, the French government does not deal with its opponents in such ways. What is interesting about this, it is that it was completely false. It was completely false. The people issuing the statement probably knew it was completely false. Those two agents, when they got arrested, it came out that they had Swiss passports. When they got made and their identities got burned, it's an instant smoking gun for France, right? You can see these guys' reps. You can see their history. It turns out that they were not who they said they were. Carbon / Frederic has successfully escaped internationally to Israel just before the attack occurred. And there are a lot of other people, later researchers would learn, from these two diving teams that also got away. And some of it really is action movie stuff. Like one of the teams that transported the explosives, they did so on a yacht, and then they did get detained in Australia, but because of Australian law, they couldn't be held. And so they went back on their yacht and they went off, and then they hitched a ride with a French submarine, and the French submarine sank the yacht. This was very scorched earth. They really did not want to leave traces, but their attempts at a cover-up were, as you said, Matt, quite unsuccessful. It was soon very, very clear to the government of New Zealand that their so-called ally France had clearly and purposefully and successfully conspired to blow the Rainbow Warrior out of the water, consequences be damned. And this is such an escalation from just trying to bribe people with $5,000.
Or even sending a bunch of heavies on board to beat up the people who are on that ship they're trying to protest. Even, we can talk about the intentions later, but even if the intentions of the government were simply to scuttle the ship or to sink the ship and not harm anybody, that's still an act of terrorism. At least now it would be considered that.
Yeah, very much so. And, we have to keep in mind that some of these conversations aren't making it to the public sphere just yet. There's a moment where New Zealand sends over like physical evidence to France. We know what you did.
So
yeah, we know what you did. Yeah, what's good? And this became a political scandal as word got out. So you see a domino effect of French politicians leaving office. The Minister of Defense at the time, Charles Hernu, he resigns. And then the head of the DGSE is a guy named Admiral Pierre Lacoste. He is fired. And, if you're familiar with a lot of the upper reaches of Western politics, usually what happens when someone gets fired is they say they're retiring to spend time with their family or something innocuous like that.
That's the out they give you, I suppose. No one wants to utterly, well, there are times where they do want to utterly run you up the flagpole. But this was not one of those situations, I suppose.
Sometimes you have to take a break to pursue painting if you're, an ex-president.
So this is the problem, though. They still have these two agents on the hook. The captains you mentioned earlier, Noel, they have been arrested. And eventually they get released to French custody and then they go free. But the reality of what happened behind the scenes, how France got those guys back and how they got away with this attack, it's the dirty part of international affairs. These guys were both sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. They pled guilty to manslaughter. And then France went back to New Zealand and threatened to wage economic warfare. They said, look, we're going to shut your stuff down. You will not be able to export anything to Europe unless you give us our operatives back. And this was not an empty threat. It would have absolutely crippled New Zealand's economy. It was highly independent on agricultural exports to the United Kingdom. And this kind of sending in the economic heavies, to borrow your earlier phrase, Matt, this stuff happens way more often than people would like to think. And
it's like that book, yeah. The Economic Hitman.
Yes, yeah, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. No kidding, that's a great read. On September 22nd, 1985, the prime minister at the time finally admits the bombing has been a French plot. And he says, the truth is cruel. There was an operation. There was a resulting cover-up. And they went on to say agents of the French Secret Service sank this boat. They were acting on orders. The elephant in the room, the other shoe waiting to drop. Whose orders exactly? And that's a question that remains officially unanswered in the modern day. So in a way, the conspiracy is still afoot. The Western world, in New Zealand's opinion, really dropped the ball. They didn't condemn France at all. And this had serious ramifications for the way New Zealand saw other European countries, the way it saw the US especially. And in 1987, France ponied up compensation for the Portuguese photographer's family. And then they also gave Greenpeace the equivalent of $8.16 million.
Yeah, $8.16 million. So after a little time goes by, details of the actual conspiracy start to trickle out. And here's what we know. There were two teams involved in transporting and placing those bombs. According to some confessions obtained later, these confessions were from the operatives involved. The plan was never to injure anybody. With the boat docked, they thought they could just kind of render the ship inert, or at least just wreck it, so it couldn't be used, but not actually risk losing any lives. But they goofed, didn't they? The dive team placed the explosives as planned, but the explosions were larger than they had predicted, which to me, doesn't that mean that there was too much explosive? Or is it just one of these things like we're talking about with circumstances that could cause, variables that could cause the explosions to differ?
There's quite a few things going on here. First thing you need to know is that the original plan was to place the explosives on the opposite side of the hull, the other side of the ship. But there was another boat kind of near there, and there seemed to be people on that boat, and they didn't want to, at least according to the confessions here, they didn't want to harm anyone on that boat. So they decided just in the moment to switch sides on the boat. And again, the engine room is right there. The whole, who knows what factors led to the size of that explosion. But what we do know is that the explosion came from the outside of the ship, and the damage that you can see to the hull from that explosion that then goes in and moves into the boat is big.
Yeah, and there's shrapnel flying. This is the thing. I think we were talking about this a little bit off air. This is one of the things that gets me. How are you going to so extensively plan an operation like this and, as one of the operatives later said, not test it? They didn't test it on a boat. And Matt, you raised an interesting point about how we should regard France's nuclear experiments, right? Those are the biggest explosives. And I can't quite remember how you put it.
Yeah, the French military has the time and funds to test all of those nukes, however many at that time in 1985, however many they had tested at that point since the 60s. They had the time and all that money, the millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to do that. But they didn't have enough time and money to test one probably small, what do you think? Maybe C4? I don't know. I doubt it was dynamite or anything like that. It had to be some kind of plastic explosive. But
yeah, but they didn't test that part. Everything else, they had these identities, they had personas, they had transported explosives through international waters. They never tested it out. And that's something that happens with a lot of government conspiracies. Something goes wrong. They messed up. And this again could be for any number of factors that change on the ground.
But that first explosion wasn't even the major issue. Even though it was larger than they expected, and it did sink the ship faster than the timeline, than they expected, that isn't what killed anybody. It was like we said, it was that second explosion.
Right. And you can even see the logic. The 4-minute interval between explosions could be baked in to allow people to hear that first explosion, maybe even almost as a warning, and then abandon ship. But they didn't bet on someone, whatever their calculations were, they didn't bet on someone coming back so soon after that first explosion. And there's a really interesting interview out of TV New Zealand that was later aired on Democracy Now!, I think, where you can hear firsthand from one of the operatives about what went down. It was 30 years after the fact. But before we get to that guy, let's talk just a little bit about the continuing cover-up. So here's the thing. Other than the two men who were briefly arrested, no one ended up facing criminal charges for this act. Nobody, other than those two guys, and they eventually were let go. In 2005, the French newspaper of note, Le Monde, released a report from 1986 where the former head of DGSE said that it had been signed off by the president, Mitterrand. He had explicitly said, yeah, okay, that makes sense, blow it up. And
that's intense. Yeah, executive orders.
Right. And so, when this admiral comes forward, he also gives the newspaper interviews about this situation. And he said, personally, this weighs on my conscience. We were not trying to kill people. But as history has proven pretty often, prosecuting a president is a difficult endeavor. There's a reason that the U.S. has that law about invading The Hague.
Yeah, it's very true. I want to jump to this individual we're talking about, the operative that confessed. This is the guy that led operations on the ground or in the water in this case. He's the person in charge of the whole thing. And he is the one that physically placed, or at least he says he's the one who physically placed the explosives onto the ship. And it's intense that he's the one who came forward to confess all of this and tell the world.
Yeah,
and
Jean-Luc
specifically
Kister.
to speak to the daughter of the photographer who was killed.
Yeah, Jean-Luc Kister, and it's a pretty in-depth interview. He answers questions that would naturally occur, like, why did you have a crisis of conscience 30 years after the fact, right? And his answer is something that I think a lot of people in the audience could understand today. If not agree with, you can understand where he's coming from. He said, look, this wasn't my only operation. I was active for a while. I was doing a lot of stuff, and I couldn't come forward because it could compromise those things. And then also, I'm first and foremost, I was a soldier. So I had to carry out orders. If you are a soldier, in his explanation, then you are mandated to do what you're told, even if you have questions or concerns, whether they are operational or ethical. So he heavily implies his hands were tied. He apologizes. And like you said, Matt, he requests the opportunity to speak with Pereira's daughter and apologize in person, and she declines it. And so now, with no real official consequences, the government of France has paid compensation. They've made apologies to New Zealand over the years a couple of different times, and the relationship between France and New Zealand seems to have normalized over the intervening years. But as we record today, don't be fooled. There's still calls for prosecution echoing in the halls of Greenpeace, echoing in the halls of New Zealand to the modern day. And this is where our story, for now, pauses. And we have to ask, at the risk of sounding cynical, Matt, Noel, I feel like the three of us in particular just sort of assume stuff like this is happening possibly now, right? And we just don't hear about it.
Yeah, maybe not with, sexy names like Rainbow Warrior, but certainly this doesn't seem like too much of a stretch now.
Well, yeah, I mean, it does make me wonder about the powerful forces that go up against environmental activists of any kind. But it's weird because it feels like it, as we said before, these groups seem more like an annoyance to me for a big superpower like that than a real threat. Unless these forces really do put more weight into kind of what we were talking about before, the heart. If they're worried about heart more than some of the other powers, just from a PR, from a hearts and minds standpoint of the voters in their country and or the other voting countries in NATO and some of these other, the UN and these things, I could see them wanting to stop those kind of annoyances or the things that make them look bad.
Well, but it makes me think of a movie. Britt Marling is like an actor, writer, director, and she made a couple cool films. One's called Another Earth. It's like a science fiction thing. And then she made one called The East that's about a environmental terrorist group that is executing these covert attacks on major polluting corporations. And I'm not saying that's what you should do and that's the only way to get it done, but to elevate your cause from annoyance to absolute nemesis, or to go toe to toe with these companies, you either, like you said, Matt, have to really have an effective way of changing the hearts and minds of people that really matter, or you gotta just burn it all down. And that's not particularly productive either. And then it makes you kind of just as bad as the people you're fighting. But I understand the frustration when it comes to like, how do I take a stand against these giant corporations when it feels like doing it the right way often falls on deaf ears and is sort of easily brushed to the side.
Sure. Yeah. Because I mean, the fact of the matter is that it's very difficult for someone to take on entities like this in court, the expenses alone. And I think we have similar questions, because why would the French government not just arrest these people when they cross into the exclusion zone? And what consequences should there be for the people who were involved? And it's a question that hasn't been answered to the satisfaction of a lot of people. Obviously, we believe that there are more operations like this that have yet to be exposed. There may be some going on while we're recording. And this is where we pass the heart ring to you. What do you think? Why did France do this? What was their ultimate goal? What did they expect would happen? What other operations like this do you believe have occurred in the modern day? And, when do you think the public will learn about them, if ever? We can't wait to hear from you. We try to be easy to find online.
Yeah, find us online. We are Conspiracy Stuff on Facebook and Twitter, Conspiracy Stuff Show on Instagram. While you're tooling around on the internet, why not tool your way over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review? We would be much appreciative of said positive review. 5 stars, if you please. And then you can also give us a call on the telephone, like if you're old school and don't like to go on the internet.
That's right. Our phone number is 1-833-STDWYTK. Leave us a message. Tell us what name you'd like for us to call you. It doesn't have to be your real name. Then say whatever you want us to play on air. Then after that, anything you want to say personally to us, please go for it. I know Paul, Mission Control Decant, wants to hear from you, so he's waiting for your messages. Let's put out a special call, Messages for Paul, and we'll have a special segment at some point, and we'll make Paul respond.
Oh, I'm not a fan of making people do things. But we can be incentivized.
Too bad.
All right, 1-833, call for Paul. So if you don't care for the phone, if you don't care for social media, no worries. We have your back. We don't want you to squeeze a 10-minute story into 3 minutes if it doesn't do it justice. You can respond to us in full. We read every email we get, and you can always send us a good old-fashioned email where we are.
Conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.